I've been working in the police force for 6.5 years. My story happened 2 years ago. I received a call about a naked man running through the streets, knocking on doors and waiting for someone to open. At the time, I was training a young police officer fresh out of the academy called John. When we arrived at the scene, we communicated with dispatch and informed them that we were on the scene. As John had just left the academy and was in training with me, I let him lead the approach. As we approached the man, he was shouting words we didn't understand, and to this day we don't believe it was a real language. Given his suspicious behavior, we suspected that he was under the influence of heavy drugs. We took all the necessary precautions when approaching him. John tried to talk to the man, but he just shouted "John" and said no, then whispered something and pointed at me. As a police officer with a few years' experience, I considered the possibility that this man was someone I had arrested before, although I couldn't remember him. Complying with his request, I began to interact with him, without having any idea that this moment would have a lasting impact on my life. I began by asking him what he was doing outside, running around naked like that. His answer was disconcerting. "The devil told me to do it. I have to find the good blood, believe it or not." I'd heard similar stories before, although not exactly in the same way. People on drugs often want to communicate with the devil. However, there was something in his facial expression that indicated that he really believed this, beyond the drug-induced high. I decided to ask him what kind of substance he had used that night, perhaps some new, legal drug that was circulating, just to try to understand the situation better. At that moment, he stopped, looked at me and said, "You look good." The man must have been around 35 years old, and at that point, I started to get restless. Putting my hand on the gun, we had enough reason to stop him before the situation got any worse, so I took the decision to handcuff him, and he offered no resistance, going with us without a problem. However, that didn't stop him from continuing to say nonsensical things in the back of the car. When we arrived at the police station, the registration agents met us at the door. They took him to do a body search and then started the fingerprinting process. He asked when he could make his phone call, and the officers said as soon as they finished the process. He remained silent until he was able to make his call. At this point, we already knew that his name was Clay. The strange part happened when John asked him which phone number he would like to call. Clay provided a number that showed up as private on our caller ID, although that wasn't unusual. As soon as someone answered the phone, John handed it to Clay on the other side of the partition. Clay started talking in a strange language again, looking at me and smiling. We were surprised, but he continued talking to the person on the other end of the line while keeping his gaze fixed on me. For a moment, he was silent, as if he was listening to the person on the other end of the line. Suddenly, he fell backwards and started convulsing before the officers could get close. He began to move bizarrely, as if he were imitating the movement of a spider, completely out of his mind. He got up from the floor, put his hand close to the glass and said something before knocking himself out, hitting his head on the glass. 2 days passed, and my partner and I went back to work. John asked me if I remember the naked and upset man. Jokingly, I replied that we would probably have to arrest him again soon, as repeat offenders were common. The rest of the evening was normal, but when I got home after my shift, things got strange. Normally, I finished work around 6 a.m., since I worked nights, and got home around 6:30 every day. That day, as I approached the door, I noticed something peculiar in front of my house. At first, I thought my wife might have put something on the door, like a rug or something. However, as I got closer, I realized that they weren't carpets. They were 6 dead birds arranged in the shape of a triangle. And, believe it or not, inside that triangle was a chalice. I knew in my mind that someone had put it there, but why? By whom? Over the next few days, things got even stranger. I heard knocks on the door for no apparent reason and suggested that my wife start carrying a pocket knife, just in case. In addition, we found more dead birds on our doorstep and marks on our vehicles. However, what happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was November 13th. At around 5:30 in the morning, my wife and I were going to visit my mother, who lived about half an hour away by car. During the visit, at around 7:50, I received a call from our security company. asking if I had entered the house and if I needed to give them the password. I replied that we weren't in town, and they said they would call the police. They informed me that the bathroom window had been broken. Knowing that someone had broken into my house, I called the captain on duty that night to find out who would be there when I got home. He replied that John would be there and that he needed the overtime anyway. I hung up with the captain and called John on his private cell phone. He picked up, and I told him what was going on. I asked how long he would be, and he said he was on his way. The rest of the story seemed surreal to me, and it still affects me deeply. When I got home, several police cars were in my yard. Some officers approached me before I could get to the door, and I asked them where John was and what was going on. They replied that they were still looking for the person responsible, but they couldn't find me. As I approached my own house, one of them asked me to light a cigarette. Although I didn't understand why, I thought the intruder had stolen my things or something, but nothing compared to what I heard next. A policewoman put her hand on my shoulder and told me that John was gone. I don't remember exactly how I looked at that moment, but I felt confused and didn't understand what I had just heard. I asked her what the hell she had just said, and she replied that John had been shot in the back several times and that there was a message. I wanted to see that message, and I wanted to see John too, but the forensics team wouldn't let me. They did the same with the message. I knew who had done it. My face went pale, my hands started to sweat, and my eyes filled with tears. The drug-addled psychopath had broken into my house and killed my partner. I couldn't stop wishing that it had been me who had come home. My uncle worked as a police officer for almost 3 decades, and he used to say that he witnessed almost everything during that time: drug raids, car accidents, and even helping to deliver twins in the parking lot. However, I'm about to share a story that is perhaps the strangest of all. I must warn you that this narrative contains graphic content and is not recommended for sensitive people. In 2002, my uncle was working as a state patrolman in southern Georgia. He often patrolled those deserted roads, where the only signs of civilization were the occasional gas station. Back then, most of the calls he received involved travelers with problems with their cars, such as flat tires or overheating radiators. Most of these incidents, as he used to describe them, went smoothly. However, in August 2002, everything changed. Just after a summer rainstorm, just before sunset, my uncle received a call about an 18-wheeler that had skidded in the rain and overturned. The accident had blocked traffic and was quickly becoming a critical situation. My uncle was nearby and promptly responded to the call. When he arrived at the scene, he found the truck on fire. The driver was still trapped in the cab, clinging to the steering wheel and struggling frantically as the flames spread over the hood and into the cab. At the time, the police had protocols advising against approaching a burning vehicle, but my uncle saw the man in trouble and ignored the orders. My uncle and the driver struggled desperately with the seatbelt and steering wheel in an attempt to free him from the burning cab, but nothing worked. The fire devoured the cabin, forcing my uncle out of it. The man was still trapped and began to cry out, begging my uncle to at least kill him so that he wouldn't have to burn to death. Legally, my uncle was prevented from doing this, as shooting the man would be tantamount to committing murder. However, the man begged for mercy, asking my uncle not to let his wife see a charred corpse, because then she would know that he had suffered a horrible and painful death. He didn't want the onlookers, the people who got out of their vehicles, to watch in horror what was happening, to witness a man screaming and burning alive. My uncle, of course, couldn't do that. He couldn't stand by and let the truck driver suffer. He acted on instinct and drew his gun from its holster. The truck driver, whose pants and shirt were already on fire, saw this and started crying, asking my uncle to hurry because he had never felt so much pain in his life. My uncle did as the man asked. Now, I could tell you all the details about the legal drama that unfolded after that, but that's not the point of the story. Suffice to say that the truck driver's wife refused to press charges and considered my uncle an angel of mercy. The story doesn't end there. Since that day, My uncle says he has never felt completely alone at home, at work, or anywhere else. For years, he didn't give it a name and often dismissed it as paranoia, stress, or lack of sleep. He's not the kind of man who believes in spirits or anything like that, so thoughts of the paranormal never crossed his mind. That was until November 2012, when my uncle retired from work and took up the hobby of transporting rental cars from dealership to dealership. He was usually racing against time on these trips, which sometimes stretched into long hours, with few rest stops. Halfway through, on the longer journeys, he would often travel with a partner so that they could take turns when one of them got tired. However, on one particular occasion, his usual partner was ill and couldn't make it. He could have refused the job, but due to a nasty divorce, he needed the money. The journey would take him 16 hours, not counting the stops. He knew it would be an arduous journey, but he had faced worse situations in his working days and thought he could do it without any problems. The first 13 hours of the journey passed without incident, but the steering was wearing more than he expected. Before he knew it, he was struggling to stay aware of what was going on around him. However, he was stubborn and, with only 2 hours left, he was determined to carry on and get the car to its destination. He still has trouble understanding what happened next. He was surrounded by two 18-wheel trucks, one in front and one behind. The car he was driving was a Ford Taurus, a vehicle that usually goes unnoticed by large trucks. He saw the truck in front brake sharply and intended to do the same. However, before he could take his foot off the accelerator, that strange sensation of not being alone enveloped him. It was more intense than ever. He didn't know what made him do it, but he looked at the passenger seat next to him, expecting to see that it was empty, as it had been since the start of the journey. But it wasn't empty. Sitting next to him was the face he would never forget, the truck driver he had killed years ago. His hands and face were badly disfigured and charred by the fire. He was perplexed. He didn't know how this was possible and thought he was hallucinating from exhaustion. However, the man shouted at him and then reached for the steering wheel, pulling it violently to the right, out of his hands. The car swerved in time to avoid the truck in front and escape when the truck behind them collided at high speed with the stationary truck in front. He braked sharply, his heart racing. He felt compelled to get out of the car and check on the truck drivers. The other truck driver was pale when he got out of his cab, but insisted that he didn't even know my uncle was in front of him. He asked my uncle repeatedly how he managed to get out of the way in time, but my uncle had no answer. At least no answer that made sense. Since that day, he has never felt that sensation again, and although he finds it hard to believe in anything paranormal, he knows what he saw. He knows what happened. He knows he wasn't alone in the car that day. It was the day the ghost of the man he killed in an act of mercy came back to pay the debt. As a young policeman in a southern city, I'm living out a dream I've had since childhood. Back then, I made badges out of aluminum foil and carved pieces of wood to imitate pistols, letting my imagination run wild. Now, nearly 2 decades later, sleep eludes me and anxiety consumes me incessantly. The harsh reality of my profession is shared by my colleagues, and I harbor no illusions of sympathy. In 2018, I responded to a welfare check, only to find my wife as a decomposing body hanging from a copper wire inside a cupboard. The grim spectacle, with the skin separated at the point of attachment to the wire, was a lesson in morbid anatomy. By mid-June, the intensified smell had become unbearable, but dead bodies had become very familiar. In 2019, I helped pull a woman from the asphalt after an accident, while her surviving husband watched from afar. This recurring situation involves dealing with anguished loved ones week after week. The horrors continued in 2020, when I witnessed the fiery death of a homeless man inside a shed, trapped due to a locked door and a narrow window. He burned to the ground while the fire department took over the case, adding yet another macabre incident to my mental collection. Please understand that my intention is not to sound insensitive or superior. My purpose is to present the harsh reality I face. However, as grotesque as these stories may seem, they don't feed my despondency, and anxiety rarely crosses my mind. The real trauma that haunts me came in 2021, triggered by a call I answered at 3 in the morning. I was typing up a theft report in my patrol car, while a TV series was playing in the background. The scene on the screen reflected a similar dramatic moment, in the light of a full moon, as in A Midsummer Night's Dream from the 80s. My usual patrol partner was off duty due to staff shortages, and I found myself alone, immersed in this sinister atmosphere. A task that at first glance seemed routine, but occasionally led to dark discoveries, was the welfare check. This involved ensuring an individual's well-being, often at the request of worried family members who were unable to get in touch with them. I was given these details as I made my way to the location, which was the home of an elderly woman on the outskirts of town. Her granddaughter, who lived in another state, had lost contact and suspected that her grandmother's phone was on silent mode by mistake. I started the mission alone. Although normally 2 patrols were assigned to tasks of this kind, it was a judgment-based decision, balancing staffing levels and the perceived nature of the call. My journey took me along a desolate dirt road, lit only by the headlights of my patrol vehicle. Beyond the mailbox was a locked gate and a long driveway. I hesitated to walk down it in the dark, as the silence was deafening, marked only by the sound of the gravel under my tires. Moments like these made me question my decision, but I chose to overcome my discomfort and jumped over the gate. The moonlight was my only guidance, for without it, the darkness would have been impenetrable. I used my flashlight sparingly so as not to be completely exposed. When I reached the house, I came across an old 2-story structure and was confronted with a truly surreal scene. All the windows were shrouded in darkness, except for one on the 2nd floor, decorated with a purple curtain with white stripes. I carefully climbed the creaky balcony and forced my ears to pick up any sound. The silence was absolute. No television, no creaks, no hum of appliances. I knocked lightly on the door and announced my presence, but received no response. I increased the volume of the knocks and announcements, but the silence remained unbroken. As I stepped out onto the balcony, I assessed my strategy, and my gaze turned to the illuminated window on the 2nd floor. An unsettling feeling of being watched washed over me, although it was impossible to discern whether anyone was behind the window watching me due to the lack of light. A sensation of icy fingers running down my spine washed over me. Although logically this shouldn't have disturbed me, the situation was inexplicable. With the light off, I couldn't determine whether someone was there or whether my imagination was running wild. Gathering my courage, I took my flashlight and directed its light through the window. The space was empty. There was no one there. However, the curtain swayed gently, as if touched by an invisible hand. Returning to the front door, I knocked harder and repeated my identification, desperate for an answer. "Cynthia, it's the police. I'm here to check on your well-being." The minutes dragged by in eerie silence as I waited patiently. I had done my duty to ensure that she was alive and well. If she chose not to respond, I couldn't force the situation, especially without a partner to back me up. Before I took a step back, a thought occurred to me. Why not try the door handle? Although it was an unconventional action, without a warrant, exceptional circumstances, or permission, I hesitated and then turned the handle. Surprisingly, the door opened, revealing the inside of the house, and the strong smell hit me immediately, almost making me lose my balance. Grabbing my flashlight, I illuminated the room, which was a veritable house of horrors. Every wall and corner showed the grotesque scene of cats crucified on wooden crosses. Some were in a state of decomposition. Other bizarre elements had appeared and blood soaked every surface. The floor was littered with hair and loose claws, and a tangible sense of horror hung in the air. I tried to examine the cupboard, but it was empty. Staggering downstairs, I barely made it to the front porch before I was hit by intense bouts of nausea. Just then, my partner arrived, and we immediately called for reinforcements. Together, we carried out a thorough search of the house, but found no sign of Cynthia. The next day, her relatives and granddaughter arrived. After searching the area, they found her car abandoned in the woods, and Cynthia's body lying lifeless on the passenger seat, indicating that she had been dead for several days. Despite all our efforts, including the help of detectives and a coroner. We were unable to determine the cause of her death. During the interviews, another family member revealed that Cynthia was suffering from severe schizophrenia and dementia. In her kitchen drawer, detectives found pages of handwritten Hebrew text that revealed her devotion to a mysterious entity. Her notes proclaimed the need to sacrifice her beloved cats. Some speculate that what they heard was actually Cynthia's laughter and screams, along with a mysterious light in the upstairs bedroom, while others remain skeptical. Personally, I even question the veracity of my experience. Curiously, the images from my body camera were never sent to the system. Even though I was sure I was recording them, it's as if the evidence had disappeared. No other calls that night produced any data, an intriguing phenomenon that left my department baffled. My nights are haunted by constant nightmares. In my dreams, she laughs with that same chilling tone. Her fingers are abnormally long. Her nails graze the floor as she moves. Invariably, I never manage to escape her grasp. My movements are always too slow, and when I try to reach for my gun, it simply disappears from my hand. It always wins, and then I wake up, because I'm still a policeman. It's a difficult question to answer. Maybe it's because it's all I know, and I still have 12 years to go before I retire. With countless therapy sessions ahead of me, retirement seems a distant goal. My view of the supernatural changed dramatically after this encounter. For those aspiring to join the police, I urge you to consider a career as a firefighter instead.